Howdy folks, my name is Ben Blackwood and I'm the Woodfire resident at the Clay Studio of Missoula. Today I'm here to show you the step-by-step process of how I made this tumbler look like this tumbler. The first step of this process is preparing your clay body. For a while now, I have been infatuated with the local clays we have available to dig out of our road cuts and wild landscapes here in Montana. Unfortunately, in order to keep up with the rate I would like to produce at, I don't want to dig and consume thousands of pounds of these resources every year. So instead, I've learned to build clay bodies that emulate the working and firing properties of these local clays, and then choose to use those clays as slips or glaze material so that I can still bring the colors and surfaces I like to the pieces and the building quality without depleting those resources. The most simplest example I have of creating a clay body out of commercial materials that looks like one of these wild clays is to literally just take any bag of commercial clay. In this case, I have got John's Blend from the Archie Bray Foundation and a cup here full of Silica Sand. I've got a couple different mesh sizes mixed together in here, a 70 mesh, a 20-30 blend, and a 16 mesh. The production company is Lane Mountain Sand, and for those of you in the Missoula area, you can buy bags of this down at Mutual Materials. But there's usually some form of silica sand available at any pottery supply store. So, I'll take my clay, I'll make a little patty. And I'll just pour that sand right over the top of it. Again, I'm already pre-mixed here with ratios I like, which is heaviest with the 70 mesh for building strength, a little less heavy with the 20-30, so that's where you start to get a little bit of the toothy grit, and then just a little bit of the 16 mesh. Where I'm building bigger work, I would go heavier on those bigger mesh sizes, but because these tumblers are going to have fairly thin walls, you don't want to go too heavy on those thicker grits because silica sand will not flux out in the firing. So if you get enough of it in a small area, it will cause a hole through your work and your cups will leak. Ran into that problem enough times by now that I'm not going to waste my time putting too much big grit in here. So anyways, got my clay patty here covered in sand. Take my paddle and kind of beat some of that in there. Use that backside to work up some of this extra sand. And I'll start working this slab into a single ball of clay. And just wedge that all right up. And you'll end up with a fairly even dispersion of all this sand and grit. As I'm wedging, I'm kind of just going around and using this clay to also clean up my mess of sand that I've spread all over my nice dining room table. Alright, now I've got a gritty lump of clay. This is far more material than I'm going to need to build one of these tumblers, but it's always kind of nice to build with a little bit of excess, or prepare a little bit of excess clay just in case. You know, sometimes you roll bad coils, sometimes you have scrap, sometimes things dry out. Never hurts to be a little bit over prepared. So first things first, the base. I'm gonna continue wedging this a little bit, and I'm really gonna focus a lot on compressing this clay right now. As most of you makers know, one of the easiest ways to have a pot fail is the S-crack down at the bottom when making little cups and whatnot. By S-crack, I mean the little crack that forms in the foot of a cup or a bowl or a jar or whatever you make, because the clay has not been compressed enough. So when the pot dries out and fires, the bottom separates. So, to prevent this, we use compression. Push all these clay particles together as tight as possible. Just throwing out my slab here, tossing it and letting it catch on the table, flipping it upside down, right side up, trying to make both sides stretch and compress at more equal rates. Alright, I've got something fairly workable now. And I'll take my paddle again. I'm going to start compressing the slab. There's lots of paddles available out there. You can buy nice ones, but you can also kind of just make use of whatever you have around you. For example, right now I'm using a wooden spoon for cooking. In my studio I also just use a 2x4 that's about 18 inches long, or I don't know, whatever you can find. So, I've compressed both sides of this slab, and I'm ready to put it on my banding wheel. One more time, I'm going to compress it down onto my wheel head. So, I have a nice little slab here. I'm going to spin that around, give myself a nice even starting point. I'm going to make a note now of how thick this little slab is and pay attention to it. Remember that thickness, because at the end of this, if you want to carve out a little bit of your foot, you want to know exactly how much clay you can move without cutting through your piece. But I've got that, so now I'm going to start working my way up. So now I'm just using my thumb to push the clay in, and I'm working the clay slab at the bottom to a base the size I want to start my tumbler at. I like a fairly tall, narrow, elegant tumbler. It's what I prefer to use when I'm drinking out of it. It's what I prefer looking at aesthetically and what I enjoy making. So I will really work this clay in pretty thin. Basically as thin as I can reasonably continue keeping a couple fingers inside to work the shape out and pinch coils. Not terribly concerned with getting things perfectly centered. I like to have it close for the ease of building, but ultimately a perfectly centered object kind of bores me. Keeps things a little bit different every time you make when you let them slip away from perfection. I'm really focusing on this inside corner here, really trying to make sure my clay walls are even from the base all the way up to the lip I'm creating just now. Now that you have this kind of base piece started, you can either just keep carrying on from here and building, or you can walk away and let this set up for just a few minutes. 5-10 minutes is all, nothing too long, but it'll just give that a little bit of extra stiffness so that as you continue to build, the bottom will be less likely to kind of collapse or slump out on you as you add weight onto it. So, for the ease of building today, and so I don't collapse this cup in front of you, I'm gonna go ahead and let this set up for a few minutes, okay? All right, this has had a few minutes to set up. Again, just 5 or 10 minutes, nothing too long, because the idea is that while it got a head start on the drying process, it's still very tacky to the touch, because the goal as I build here is to not have to use water to attach my coils together. Mostly for quickness and efficiency of building, as well as not creating kind of moisture differentials at every layer in the cup. Yeah, I don't think it's gonna ruin a cup to slip and score it. I think we all know that it works, but if I can keep the whole cup at a very similar moisture consistency as I build it, I feel better about it. I feel like it'll be a little bit stronger as it makes its way through the whole firing process. So, that's what I do. Now, we're gonna start rolling coils. I start by just pinching out a little log here, squeezing one out, and rolling it kind of as evenly as possible. Again, things don't need to be perfect. As far as coil thickness goes, I think that's going to be something that you will kind of determine on your own what works best for you. I am usually looking for a happy medium between thick enough that I can gain some serious headway each time I add a coil, so I'm not constantly attaching and overworking clay, but also thin enough that I'm not trying to work a bratwurst out into 1/8 of an inch thick sidewall. So yeah, as you make, you'll kind of find the coil thickness that works for you as well as for the pots you're building. You know, thinner walled pots, I do slightly thinner coils than I would making a big jar, for example. So, I've got my coil here. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna score it. I've got that to open things up, and I'm also gonna score kind of this top rim of the base of the tumbler I'm working on, as well as a little bit inside. I like to attach my coils inside my pot. It was kind of a way that worked for me as I was beginning to learn coil building. I don't think either way is necessarily better or worse than the other. But the one advantage it does give me as I build is that it tends to allow the exterior of the cup dry a little bit quicker than the interior because you're adding the fresh clay to the inside. And so that exterior skin of the pot can kind of stretch and sometimes get kind of like a nice crackling effect that I kind of like. But it doesn't always do that. You know, this is fairly wet clay I'm working with, so I don't think it'll stretch quite or break quite as much as I stretch it. We'll see what happens. So I've got my coil attached to the inside. I scored, but I didn't slip. I explained to you why I don't like slipping, but as far as continuing to score the piece, I think those rough textures are going to lock together better than two totally smooth clay surfaces. And then opening up the coil and the pot, the clay that you're adding the clay to, I think it just allows it all to kind of squish together a little bit easier, works together easier, and makes the building process easier. So that's what I do, and it seems to work. So I'm going to keep doing it. And I'm paying attention to, you know, I'm really feeling out the thickness of the clay. I've got one set of fingers going a little bit deeper into the cup so that I can match the sidewalls all the way up, and then kind of match that galloper, if you will, with the tips of my fingers just pinching the top. So the whole way I'm pinching two heights on the piece. And I'm also using using my thumbs to work into my fingers as opposed to like a big both side pinch, right? So this whole time I'm actively working the clay inwards and upwards, because if I build this pretty much directly upwards, if that's my goal, the tendency of clay wanting to fall out will kind of give me that nice, very, very gradual, slender shape that I'm going for. So we have one coil on there. And kind of, when I'm pinching pots and I want to keep that pinched texture, instead of using a paddle, I end up using my knuckles to kind of paddle clay into shape against supporting fingers on the inside. So that allows me to keep all of the nice pinch marks that I'm looking for, but also paddle the clay to keep it to keep the shape tight and going along the track that I want it to. So we got one on, and I'm just going to jump right into the next one. Score the top, score the inside. I still have leftover clay from the last coil I rolled, so I'm just going to go ahead and use that for my next layer. this last coil I rolled, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. I don't like to try and work too many rows out of the same coil. You know, I don't roll out all my coils ahead of time and then just build the whole pot through. Mostly because I want to roll out a fresh, wetter coil to add to the top, as opposed to the final coil I add on having sat out for like an hour while I build this to put on the top and then have a super kind of crackly, broken apart rim piece because I use dry clay that wants to separate from itself. But you know, 3 or 4 coils out of the same roll job is not a bad way to go. Go ahead and work on this next coil here. You can see I don't really worry too much about cleaning up my working area here. Kind of like the texture that some of these little dry pieces of clay and whatnot pick up, or that get picked up by the coil, add to the final piece. It's a very subtle element, but the layering of many subtle elements from little chunks of dry clay to sand to grit and whatnot all add up to develop those really deep dynamic surfaces where the closer you get, the more you divulge yourself into the piece, the more you see, you know, every time you look at it. Here's a closer look at exactly what my hands are doing while I pinch this out. Scoring. And supporting the form as I score. Adding the next coil. See what I'm doing with this hand here, pinching this top and kind of closing up the seam gets created when you squish the two coils together originally, at the same time supporting and pinching with my right hand. One layer of that gives me a nice kind of tight top to work with. Prevents too much exterior cracking from developing, because if you get too excited about that, the forms become weak and much more likely to leak. Alright, we're closing in on the end here. You can see we're almost to the height of the original now. The shape has a little bit more work to go, but we'll get that in the next couple coils we add. And it will take a couple more coils, right? Because if I want it to be this size afterwards, I need to build that extra 10 to 20% to make up for the shrinkage of the clay body. My general rule of thumb, because, or for tumblers at least, because I prefer to make a 16-ounce pint glass of a tumbler, I've found that my 8.5 inch to 9 inch measuring stick is usually a pretty good indicator of when I'm there. So if I can be coiled up above this point, I know that by the time we shrink after firing, I'll have a glass the size that I want to use. So, got more coils, here we go. Kind of nice. I don't know if y'all have ever worked in front of a mirror before. I haven't, but I'm sitting here now using this video screen to kind of measure the shape and angles that this cup is coming up with. And I tell you what, it's kind of a pleasure. I might have to try this in the studio, putting a little mirror up so you can just look straight ahead, get the bounce back with the full piece you're making. It's kind of convenient. work those funny curves out, get those nice straight lines that aren't really straight because they're all pinched out and everything. Love it. Alright, we've met our mark height-wise, which means one more coil. That last little bit of height, because nobody wants that to come out just a little too small. That's no fun. Plus, adding an additional coil to finish out the rim, just how we like it, is also important. Alright, so that's the final coil. It's on and it's a little worked in. And let's go close up here and I'll show you how I go about finalizing this rim. Alright, here we go. So I'm still using my right hand to continue shaping the cup, supporting the cup, and holding things up. But my left hand is now focused just on the rim here, kind of trying to pinch down the inside of the thickness of the clay and bring the outside of it up to this point here. And it kind of gives a more crisp lip. It separates it from the rest of the piece. And it also just kind of helps the way it pours and functions by creating these harder lines that will cut water as it spills over the edge, as opposed to dribbling it down the side of the entire tumbler and spilling it all on your lap as you take a drink. So we got that going for us, but then it kind of leaves this line here. And I'm okay with that being there and being subtle because it's a very honest part of the piece. But if I can make it, like I said, subtle and not so pronounced, I would like the piece a lot more. And that's what this is all about, right? Making what you like. If we were just going to make what other people liked, why not just support them as artists? And, yeah, appreciate what they make for what they do. there's the lip. All right, lip is done, shape is there. All that's left to do is kind of clean up our bottom a little bit. So I'm gonna come over under it, just to pull that bottom up a little bit. That undercut and the shadow it leaves on the table brings a huge amount of lightness to the work, as opposed to an edge that just kind of sucks right down into the table. It makes a piece feel very heavy, and especially with drinking vessels, I feel like more than almost any other pot, that lightness and that comfort, you know, even visual lightness as you approach a piece can be very important into how we perceive our enjoyment of the use of an object. So I'll go in there and kind of use my wood knife to give it that little bit of loftiness, and then just real subtly kind of went around with my finger, push down any potentially sharp points or anything like that, and work this in so it's a little bit tighter to the clay body, because I don't want thin stuff hanging off. Anything that looks like it could reasonably chip or bust at any point in my firing and making process or its future users using process. I want to make those things go away because I want this to work and I want it to not break. So there you have it. There's the foot, there's the rim, there's the tumbler. All we have to do now is wait for this to set up till it's about leather hard, and it will release from the bat all by itself. And once we hit that point, we're going to slip this with a little bit of wild clay. So we're going to use this time while our cup sets up to go ahead and make our slip and get it ready, so as soon as we're leather hard, we're ready to paint it. So what we have here is a little bit of wild clay and wood ash. This is what the wild clay looks like once dug out of the ground and dried out. Not the most workable state, clearly. Needs to either be slaked down or crushed to become usable for our purposes. So that's what I have here. I've already gone ahead and crushed the material, and this fine powder here is going to slake down really easily and make a nice slip. In addition to our wild clay, we're going to add a little bit of wood ash. This here was just collected from the firebox in my last firing. And a little bit of wood ash added to your clay will help it kind of stick to the leather hard clay body. And then it will also act as a flux. So the more wood ash you put in your clay, the more it will flux out or melt in the kiln. So the more we add, the more this slip will turn into something closer to a glaze. This combination, particularly when you add a fair amount of wood ash and go heavier on it, it pushes away from a white kaolin slip and more towards a celadon glaze. I never really measure this. I just kind of go by sight, feel, and let things come out different every time, because everywhere from this plain white slip to the really heavy wood ash celadon glaze that gets created when you mix the two, I've found to be beautiful in any way I fire it, and I'm always really happy with the results I get with this material. So I don't sweat the measurements. I just kind of let it be what it is and appreciate that little bit of surprise when you open the kiln and you find out what they look like. So here, we're going to take these, and I've already got a little cup with just a little bit of water in it to start this off with. So I'm going to add my clay to the water. I'm going to add about half of this wood ash to start, and kind of take a look at it from there. And I've used this material a few times, as I said, so I kind of have a color and a consistency that I know I like to work with, and that I know won't flux out too hard and just run right off the pots. And I found that usually, don't want to waste that clay. This is precious stuff. It takes a lot of work to go get this and process it all, so no wasting of the wild local materials. You know, this planet may be totally covered in clay, but it's only a very small amount of that clay that we potters like to use for our materials, for clays and glazes. So treat it preciously, because that is a finite resource. So I've got this all nicely mixed up now. Got a nice thick slurpy consistency here. This is another one. I kind of just let the consistency differ from piece to piece. If I want something thicker that'll kind of like trace brush strokes or whatnot, if I want to see those strokes, I'll go ahead and leave it a thicker mixture. Or if I want everything to go on a little bit smoother and more even, I'll water things down more and add those couple extra coats to increase consistency. So there you have it. Pretty easy way to make glaze, huh? Not bad. Alright, we're here. Tumbler is leather hard. It's time to pull it off the bat. Or excuse me, banding wheel. This is fairly easy. Now that it's leather hard, it just releases. Easy as that. So I'm going to take this opportunity and clean up this foot a little bit. Remember earlier I talked about recognizing how much clay you leave in case you want to carve out the bottom. I did not want to carve out the bottom. So I made sure to leave my slab thin enough that it would match the wall thickness that I was going to build with, so everything stays fairly consistent and even. I just kind of cleaned up that sharp edge from where it met the banding wheel. I'm going to push down just a little bit here, because I want it to be a little bit concave here. So what's going to happen is I'm going to fire this in the wood kiln on wads. And if it's in the wood kiln on wads, on 3 points, and the kiln gets a little hot and the clay wants to slump it all, even the tiniest amount, if I leave a flat bottom, the clay is going to slump down here. You're going to end up with a tumbler that rocks around like this. So if you're not trimming out the center and leaving a trimmed foot on the outside, it's a good idea to kind of push that in, create that indent so that the clay, well, for starters, an arch will support itself a lot better than a flat surface. But even if that arch does want to slump, it'll slump down to what will likely still be a convex surface. Your tumbler will still sit flat, like that. Alright, so we've got our bottom done where we want it. You hear that? You see that? It's hard. At this point, if I squeezed it, it would most likely break, not squish, right? It's that good leather hard consistency. That means it's ready to take slip. So, when I slip this, I'm going to start with the inside first, because I don't want to paint the outside and then have to hold on to this thing and smear that all around while I get the inside taken care of. So I've got my long skinny paintbrush and my wild clay slip, and I'm just going to work it down on the interior of this leather hard tumbler. It's a little bit harder, as you would imagine, to get that perfectly even coat that you might if you were glazing bisqueware and just pouring the this whole thing full of glaze and then dumping it all out. Obviously that's all going to suck up pretty evenly. So to help prevent any exposed clay spots, I just kind of make sure to go around the whole thing a couple times and really try and work this slip into the clay walls. Get it in there nice and thick like. Do like a nice smooth motion, make sure that bottom area comes out nice and smooth. I'm going to address the inside of this lip. Now, I'm going to move the exterior because I don't want to handle this after I've slipped it. I'll put it back on my banding wheel just for ease of painting and everything. And I'm just going to go to town on it. This slip is thick enough that it will carry some of these brush strokes through the firing process. I tend to like vertical brush strokes when I've got the thick slip, because these vertical lines tend to add height, right? As opposed to horizontal stripes where you look across the piece. These vertical ones kind of bring your eye up and down, and the form appears to be that much more taller and slender than it would with the horizontal lines on it. Because this slip is so thick right now that I'm putting on, I'm going to just do the one coat. Because I'm just doing one coat, I'm definitely going to work around this coat and really make sure I've got it worked into every area, just like I did on the inside. Because while I'm all about the variation of surfaces in a wood-fired object, a missed brush stroke looks like a missed brush stroke no matter how you fire the pot. Excess off the bottom there. So there's a couple chunks here and there from chunks of wood ash or whatever was in the wood ash because it was unsifted, and maybe a chunk or two here and there from the clay we crushed up, but you know, that's okay because these things will more than likely melt, and if they don't, they can be sanded off later, or they might just add to the surface and look good in and of themselves. And just kind of look over everything, make sure everything's good, because it's these little details right here at the end that can make or break a piece. And there you have it. And you're confident everything is good and as it should be. You got your tumbler. And ideally, it's going to shrink down to about that size, give or take. And all you really got to do from here to turn this into that is wood fire it. And that's the real fun part. Alright. Alrighty folks, there you have it. That's everything I did to prepare this cup for a wood firing. To make it look exactly as it does now. Last step for this guy is to just get it safely to the kiln, load it, and have a happy firing. Thanks for watching.